She said she was honest about hurting me. I didn't argue. I just left, and that was the end of us. I never thought I'd be someone who stayed in a relationship that made me feel smaller every day. For years, I was the friend who told others to leave when things got toxic. I thought I understood what walking away looked like. At 34, sitting across from her in our living room, I heard the words that would live with me. At least I'm honest about hurting you. They landed like something I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Not the kind of thing that makes you stand up and storm out, but the kind that makes you stop breathing long enough to ask yourself why you're still there. I remember looking at her and feeling the distance that had been growing between us for months. She said it with the sort of ease people use when they have already decided the ground beneath them is steady and someone else will keep rearranging themselves to fit. In the beginning, she was everything I wanted. Attentive, funny in a way that felt like we had our own private language, the kind of presence that made other conversations fall away. People around us noticed how alive I seemed when we were together. I carried that memory like a talisman through the early days, pulling it out whenever things cooled down or a fight left me unsure. The cracks didn't show up as big things. They were small comments tucked into conversations, jokes that landed like thorns, apologies that came with a list of excuses attached. A compliment would arrive, and later someone else's words would be twisted into proof I wasn't listening. Gradually, I learned to walk on eggshells and call it keeping the peace. I started timing my moods, watching for the moments she would be distant and preparing for when she'd swing back into warmth. That routine felt safer than the thought of upsetting her. Friends noticed before I did. They stopped inviting us to things because she made gatherings uncomfortable. They pulled me aside, asked if I was okay, told me they didn't like the way she talked to me. I heard them and tried to push the concern away. I had practiced defending her. Everyone's stressed. She has a lot going on. You don't get what she's like when she's tired. Those answers felt better than admitting that I was making excuses for the person who was hurtful. What I was really doing was protecting the image of us. The part of me that wanted to believe people could change if given enough time or if I loved them hard enough. There was a belief, almost a superstition, that my patience could bring back the early days. That hope kept me staying when a clearer head might have packed a bag. That night we argued about something I can't even remember now. It must have been small for it to dissolve into that moment where she looked at me without any attempt to soften the blow. At least I'm honest about hurting you, she said. The casualness made it worse. It wasn't an accidental slip. It was a statement of how she saw our relationship. Not as something to nurture, but as something she could use to assert control. The phrase lodged itself in my head. Honesty, she framed as a virtue even when it was cruelty. That logic twisted in on itself. If hurting me was honesty, then demanding I accept it was reasonable. If I questioned it, I was the one being unreasonable. It was a lesson in how words can be used to rearrange blame. After she said it, I didn't leave. I sat there, feeling smaller, and told myself I wasn't overreacting. I told myself she'd soften, that she simply didn't know how to say she was sorry. I tried to believe that what I had seen in the beginning, the attention, the care, was still under the surface, waiting. But the sentence hung between us and kept replaying like a cheap song you can't turn off. That was where I started to understand the strange comfort of staying. The cruelty had a shape I could predict. I could brace for it. The unknown outside, that predictability felt terrifying. So, for now, I stayed and watched myself make bargains in silence. Why did I stay? That question haunted me more than her words. I replayed the moment over and over, sitting alone at night, and the answer never felt simple. Part of it was familiarity. As strange as it sounds, her moods became something I could count on. I knew the rhythm of our days. When she'd be cold, when she'd offer affection as if it were a favor, when the cycle would spin back around again. It was a painful routine, but it was one I understood. There's a saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I never thought it applied to me, but it did. The idea of leaving meant facing a kind of emptiness I wasn't ready for. The comfort of predictability, even when it was harsh, felt less frightening than stepping into an unknown life without her. I wasn't blind. I knew she twisted the truth when it suited her. I knew she used my loyalty as leverage. I knew the laughter I once felt around her had turned into me second-guessing every word before I spoke. But leaving meant shattering the version of myself that still believed I could fix things. It meant admitting that maybe I had wasted years trying to love someone who had no intention of meeting me halfway. And worse, it meant confronting the possibility that I wasn't sure if I deserved better. Then came the night that burned into me. We were fighting about something so small that I can't even remember it now. Maybe it was dishes, maybe it was a comment that spiraled out of control. I told her she was being cruel. I expected her to defend herself, to argue, maybe even to apologize in her half-hearted way. Instead, she shrugged and said it so casually. At least I'm honest about hurting you. It wasn't just the words, it was the lack of hesitation. She didn't even flinch. There was no attempt to soften the blow, no fear of losing me. That's what made it worse. She knew I'd stay. She had tested the boundaries so many times and found that I'd bend every time. Honesty wasn't the point. Control was. I sat there, frozen, not because I didn't understand what she meant, but because I did. It wasn't a confession. It was a declaration. She was telling me who she really was, and I was sitting across from her pretending I didn't hear it. That's when the realization began to take root. People don't stay in toxic relationships because they enjoy being hurt. They stay because, over time, the hurt becomes the new normal. It settles into you like background noise. You don't notice how much space it takes up until someone points it out. It seeps into your self-image, reshaping you slowly, until leaving feels like chaos while staying feels like safety. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her words echoing in my head. My mind spun with questions I wasn't brave enough to answer. Why am I still here? Why do I accept this as love? And the most painful one, what if this is all I deserve? I didn't leave. Not that night. Not even the next week. But something inside me had cracked open. Her words didn't just sting. They revealed the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't holding on to love anymore. I was holding on to fear, routine, and the fragile hope that if I stayed long enough, she might turn back into the person I first met. And in that moment, I began to see just how deep toxic love can pull you in. I wish I could tell you that night was the end, that I stood up, walked out, and never looked back. But that isn't how it happened. Instead, I stayed. I lay awake, her words looping in my mind like a broken record. At least I'm honest about hurting you. They weren't just cruel. They were a mirror, reflecting back everything I had been avoiding. Something inside me shifted, but not enough to leave. It was the kind of shift that makes you question yourself instead of the other person. I convinced myself maybe she was just being real. Maybe her brutal honesty was better than fake sweetness. That's how I rationalized it. I twisted the meaning until it felt less ugly, because facing the raw truth felt impossible. In the days that followed, I drifted through life in a fog. I went to work, came home, laughed at her jokes when I was supposed to, and argued when she picked fights. But underneath it all, her words echoed. I couldn't shake them. Every time I thought about confronting her, I swallowed it. I told myself I'd wait until the right moment. That moment never came. Her approval had become my anchor. I didn't notice when it happened, but somewhere along the line my worth became tied to her moods. If she was affectionate, I felt alive. If she was distant, I felt worthless. I adjusted myself constantly to fit what I thought she wanted. I've been until I barely recognized the person I used to be. Leaving her wasn't just leaving a relationship. It felt like stepping off a cliff with no ground beneath me. And here's one of the hardest truths I've learned about toxic love. It doesn't start out that way. At the beginning, it's passion and intensity. It's late-night talks, promises that feel endless, and affection so overwhelming it almost feels addictive. Psychologists call it love bombing when someone showers you with so much praise and attention that you get hooked on the high. That was us in the beginning. She looked at me like I was the only person in the world. She told me she had never felt so connected to someone before. She planned futures with me, talked about places we'd go, things we'd build together. Those memories were powerful. And once you've tasted that kind of intensity, you spend the rest of the relationship chasing it, even when it's long gone. That's what kept me there. I wasn't blind to the red flags. I saw them. I felt them. But I kept clinging to the idea that maybe, if I was patient enough, if I loved her enough, I could bring back the version of her I fell for. I didn't realize that version of her was just a mask, and I was holding on to an illusion. Still, every night, I went to bed with her words in my head. At least I'm honest about hurting you. I tried to twist them into something meaningful, something that sounded like growth. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized she didn't have to. I was already too deep in to leave. Looking back, I think that was the scariest part. Not the fights, not the criticism, not even the lies. The scariest part was realizing I had silenced myself so much that I couldn't even imagine a life without her. Even if staying meant letting myself fade away a little more each day. I held on to memories like lifelines. The way she used to look at me, how the early days felt electric, how being chosen by her made me feel special. Even when her actions told a different story, I replayed those moments in my head as if they could erase the reality in front of me. I wasn't blind to the red flags, I simply refused to let go of the hope that she might return to the person I thought she was. But the truth crept in slowly, almost quietly. The person I loved at the beginning wasn't the real her. That version was a mask, and underneath it was someone who dismissed my feelings, cut me down, and, eventually, admitted she liked having control. It was a hard truth to swallow. The turning point didn't come in a fight. It came one ordinary morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty cup of coffee, staring at nothing. That's when it hit me. I hadn't laughed in months. Not the real kind of laugh that bursts out before you can stop it. The kind that makes your chest ache in a good way. I couldn't remember the last time I felt light or at ease. Instead, I was living in constant tension. Every word I said, I measured. Every move I made, I second-guessed. I apologized for things I hadn't even done just to keep the peace. I thought back to who I was before this relationship. Confident, optimistic, excited about life, and I barely recognized myself anymore. That's what toxic love does. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It erodes you piece by piece, slowly enough that you adapt without realizing how much you're losing. You tell yourself the criticism is normal. You normalize the fights. You start to believe the lies she repeats, that you're too sensitive, that no one else would put up with you, that you're lucky to have her. Friends asked me, "Why don't you just leave?" I never had a good answer. How could I explain that leaving felt like walking away from my entire identity? So much of who I was had become tied to making this relationship work, even as it drained me. Walking away felt like admitting failure, and failure felt like proof that maybe she was right about me. So I stayed. I stayed because the pain had become familiar. Because hope, even false hope, felt safer than the void of the unknown. Because I convinced myself that enduring meant I was strong. But in reality, every day I stayed, I lost another piece of myself. And the worst part? I knew it. Deep down, I knew I was disappearing. Yet I kept choosing her, hoping one more chance, one more compromise, one more day would bring back the person she pretended to be at the start. That morning at the table, staring into cold coffee, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. I was no longer living. I was surviving. And survival is not love. It was the first quiet crack in the illusion I had been clinging to. Her words wouldn't leave me. "At least I'm honest about hurting you." At first, they stung like a cruel joke, but over time, they became something else, a revelation. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't pretending. She was showing me exactly who she was, and the real question was whether I'd keep pretending not to hear her. For weeks, I tried to ignore it, but it kept circling back. Every time she brushed off my feelings, every time she twisted my words, I'd hear that line again. It was like she'd given me the key to the truth, and I just didn't want to unlock the door. The breaking point came on an ordinary evening. We weren't fighting about anything big, just dinner plans. I told her I felt brushed aside, like my input didn't matter. She looked right at me and said, almost casually, "You're lucky I even bothered to argue with you. Most people wouldn't put up with you at all." That was it. Something inside me gave way, but not in the same way it used to. I didn't shrink this time. I didn't rush to apologize or convince her I was worth more. Instead, a single question rose in my mind, clearer than anything I'd felt in months. What exactly am I holding on to? The answer hit hard. I wasn't holding on to love. I was holding on to fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of starting over at 34. Fear of admitting I had wasted years of my life on someone who never really cared. Fear had kept me tethered to her, disguised as loyalty, disguised as hope. But fear is not love, and staying out of fear is not living. That night, I sat alone in the bedroom after she fell asleep, staring at the ceiling. I thought about all the times I laughed less, all the times I apologized just to keep the peace, all the parts of myself I had given up along the way. I thought about the people who had warned me, the friendships I'd let fade because I didn't want anyone to see how bad things had gotten. And then I thought about her words again, "At least I'm honest about hurting you." For the first time, I saw them not as a jab, but as the truth I needed. She was telling me she wasn't going to change. She was telling me who she really was. And maybe, in a twisted way, that was the gift I needed to finally see clearly. The weight of it pressed down on me, but there was also something else, a strange kind of clarity. I realized I couldn't keep bargaining with myself anymore. I couldn't keep holding on to a version of her that never truly existed. For the first time in years, I admitted to myself that leaving was the only way I'd ever get my life back. It wasn't a decision I made out loud. I didn't tell her. I didn't even write it down. But in my mind, I knew. The relationship was already over. All that was left was finding the courage to act on it. Once that realization set in, everything around me felt different. The house, the routines, even her voice. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside, I felt like a clock had started ticking. I knew I couldn't stay forever. The only question was when I would finally walk away. She didn't notice at first. Or maybe she did, but she assumed it didn't matter. She was used to me folding, used to me apologizing first, used to me carrying the weight. So, when I grew quieter, when I stopped engaging in the same old arguments, she brushed it off as me being in one of my moods. But it wasn't a mood. It was me stepping back and seeing the picture clearly for the first time. I noticed how she dismissed me in front of friends, how she rolled her eyes when I shared something that mattered, how the smallest requests from me were treated like burdens while hers were treated like obligations I had to meet. I started to keep mental notes, not to hold grudges, but to remind myself of the reality I had been trying to rewrite for years. Every time she said something cruel, I didn't excuse it. I marked it down in my mind. Every time she laughed off my hurt feelings, I reminded myself, this is who she is. And with each reminder, the fear began to loosen its grip. At night, while she slept, I'd lie awake and think about life outside of this. The silence of an empty apartment. The first awkward grocery run by myself. Calling friends I hadn't spoken to in months and admitting I had been wrong. It scared me, but it also gave me a sense of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. She must have sensed something eventually, because one night she asked me if I was losing interest. I almost laughed at the irony. Interest wasn't the issue, survival was. But I didn't say that. I just told her I was tired. And it wasn't a lie. I was exhausted from carrying a relationship that had been draining me for years. Over the next few days, I noticed her trying a little harder. She'd cook my favorite meal, send me a text in the middle of the day, even compliment me here and there. But the gestures felt hollow, like rehearsed lines in a play we both knew the ending to. They weren't born out of love or care. They were survival tactics. Hers this time, not mine. And for the first time, I didn't take the bait. I didn't let those fleeting moments of affection erase the truth I had already faced. I knew I had to leave. The only thing left was finding the moment when I was ready to do it without turning back. It didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic scene. It came quietly, in the way most endings do, like the slow fading of a light you no longer have the energy to keep burning. I didn't tell her yet, but deep down, I knew. My days of staying out of fear were numbered. When the moment finally came, it wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming match, no broken plates, no ultimatums. One evening, she left to meet her friends, and I stood in the silence of the house. I looked around at the walls, the couch, the life we had built, a life that no longer felt like mine. I packed quietly, just the essentials, a few bags, some clothes, the things I couldn't replace. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe her an explanation anymore. For the first time in years, I chose silence instead of justification. Walking out that door felt unreal. My hands shook as I locked it behind me. But beneath the fear was something else, relief. Not the kind that floods you all at once, but the slow, steady kind that builds with each step you take away from what's been breaking you. The days that followed were brutal. I questioned myself constantly. Did I overreact? Was I weak? Was I selfish? That's the part no one talks about, the withdrawal. Toxic relationships are addictive. You get hooked on the highs and lows, the chaos, the chase for affection. Even knowing it was destroying me, I missed it at first. I missed her. But slowly, the fog lifted. I started sleeping through the night again. I laughed a real laugh, with an old friend over coffee. I called people I had drifted away from, and they welcomed me back without hesitation. Piece by piece, I began to remember who I was before all of this. And that's when I understood the truth. People don't stay in toxic love because they enjoy being hurt. They stay because the pain becomes familiar, because leaving feels like tearing away part of yourself. The cycle of hope and disappointment convinces you to hold on to a version of love that never really existed. Her words, "At least I'm honest about hurting you," no longer cut me. They became a reminder. A reminder that anyone who can say that without hesitation doesn't deserve a place in my life. A reminder that staying in toxic love isn't weakness, it's survival, and survival patterns can be broken with one brave decision. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the beginning of becoming myself again. She reached out weeks later. Messages, calls, little attempts to reel me back in. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I already knew her pattern, and I already knew my answer. Now, when I think about her, it's not with anger. It's with clarity. She showed me who she was, and finally, I believed her. And maybe that's why I'm sharing this here. Because I know I'm not the only one who has stayed too long, convincing themselves that fear is love. I appreciate you watching till the end. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more content.